All right, Court, I think we're live. How are you today?
Good, Joe. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Doing pretty good. Beautiful day here in Colorado. Really, really cold. Uh, a small child was telling me -23 with wind chill factor. Um, but I don't know if I believe him. We'll
Well,
see.
we're apparently facing a significant wind event, which just flew over our friends in Florida last night. So we're expecting gust of 70, and then tomorrow will be 57 degrees, and then plunging back down again the day after.
Outstanding.
Exciting
So
times.
let's give everybody a preview of what we're going to talk about today on the show. We're going to talk about chronic pain conditions, how psychedelics might be useful to treat them. We're going to talk about the new REMS thing that MAPS is working on with the FDA. That's apparently still accepting public comment, which is interesting because the public comment period closed. But and why that's an issue and why that's relevant to pain conditions. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about psychedelic education and much more. So um, I guess let's start at the top. So chronic pain, obviously, we're uh, people that have both had it. And I think I spent most of my 20s with a chronic pain condition. Probably didn't really go away until I super accelerated my psychedelic use. Um, and thankfully, I did okay. Though I imagine without support, others might not be so successful. And that's why we're here. So can you give us like super high level like your story, Court?
Sure. I was a performance and pain professional in the industry for close to 30 years through all my different roles and jobs. And I was also a study trial participant in NYU's psilocybin for major depressive disorder in March of 2020. After 5 years of increasingly treatment resistant depression, um, went through the study trial, and by end of day, I was in total remission from mid to high 40s MADRS scores. So complete and total remission by end of day. But strikingly and shockingly, I was also in total remission from ongoing moderate level chronic pain. And I hadn't been lacking for resources, knowledge, or networks like at all, like very extensive certifications and training, lots of people to consult. And yet, everything worked, but nothing lasted. And then suddenly I'm in the middle of this, speaking technically, this massive neuroplastic window, and just all the pain was gone, and like strikingly gone. And I had restoration of mobility, I had restoration of motor activity and strength, and seemingly the tissue quality had changed, very locally in some of the joints in my feet and things like that. And so it was like I was very, very um, shocked. And at the same time, because of my background in training in neuroplasticity and neuromodulation, all these things rapidly became obvious, and just started pursuing this like crazy.
Mm, I love hearing that, and thank you for coming to me when you were shortly out of that.
Yeah, you guys were a lifeline. You honestly were. Like going in, it's easy to talk now about being in remission, right? It's easy to describe. Um, I went to the trial, and then afterwards, I did all these things, and like suddenly, like therapy became way more effective and enduring than it used to be. But even though I wasn't psychedelically naive, finding that right mix of support and integration, and the flavor of the integration was so specific. And of course, I was consuming all the media I could at the time around this, like a lot of people who've experienced something like this, either in pain or psychiatric or psychological issues, but trying to figure out how to best navigate this. But you guys, it was such a standout podcast, and the resources you had online. And it's the big tent approach that it made me feel very, very secure, because I was coming from a background that really has, non-Western esoteric traditions as well as Western esoteric traditions as well. And then also this fairly intensive neuroscience background for dealing with pain and performance issues that I had been studying for the decade and a half previous. And so you guys addressed all of that. And there was also this marriage of kind of the old school and the new school, like as we're entering this renaissance. So it's like, it just seemed to me an obvious choice to reach out to you guys. And plus, I had heard a couple of your interviews with other trial participants, and I thought I might have some perspective to offer just because of what I was able to observe in real time and make it a little bit more than just a trip report, if that's fair to say.
I agree.
Not that those
Yeah.
are bad.
They're all very helpful, and I honestly get a kick out of talking to trial participants because the researchers probably don't want that out yet. But I think it's so fascinating to hear these stories in real time because people need help. The state of medicine is not ideal currently, so we're working towards that, hopefully.
Well, and that was a lot of the motivation at the time where, to whom much is granted, much is expected in return. That was something that one of my teachers, Dr. Tanya Pettiford Waits, tried to really lay on me often. Like there's this civic responsibility, and I knew how much effort it was going to take to still move the ball forward in terms of legalization and acceptance, and just changing the paradigm of what people thought of psychedelics in terms of them being efficacious medicines, and in addition to all the other things that they're capable of. But it's it's one of those things, I think, just speaking from a medicalized standpoint, it's one of those things where if you've been trying your damnedest with everything that's available and standard of care hasn't been working for you, and you find this thing that just wipes it off the map inside of about 8 hours, how do you not share that with everybody, knowing that the level of suffering that's going on out there is so pervasive and sometimes so pernicious and tenacious, right? Where people are, I've talked about this before, like, you know people suffering for years and years with these conditions, doing everything they're supposed to, and nothing works. Then they finally do this, and it's gone like that. So I was relatively fortunate that it took for me right away. That I was able, and that's also striking considering that, like, once again, my MADRS scores mid to high 40s, and apparently that study trial, the USONA study trial that just got published this past year, right? Unusually, uh, their baseline depression scores were higher than the treatment-resistant depression trials out there. So it's notable.
Right, and you did a really good job doing a literature review. You had a really good understanding and background to be able to understand chronic pain conditions, neuroscience, and more. Kind of just a perfect background to be kind of synthesizing what was out there. And you identified the stories from Albert Lin at UC San Diego, the really old studies from Germany. You're the first person I ever saw bringing those up. I think pre-war mescaline research with phantom limb people. Is that right?
Credit for the Zador mescaline, so mescaline Wirken Phantom Ostov Phantom Gliad. Yeah, mescaline Wirken. Yeah. Anyways, Oftos Phantom Gliad. That's by Julius Zador. That's from 1930, and it was actually Dr. Sandeep Nayak that brought it up on Twitter, and that's what I'll die calling it, where there was a discussion going on with me and Dr. Joel Castellanos and someone else, and then Sandeep Nayak just highlighted it like, hey, Joel Castellanos, and there it was, and I reached out to him, had a little conversation, and then just started pursuing it. And then really now, Julia Boardman has picked up the ball. She and one of her colleagues, whose name I'm sorry I forget, they both were native German speakers, at Imperial Psychedelic Research Group. And so they poured through it and did a qualitative analysis, and the translation's amazing. But yeah, the one I was focusing on early on was the Kurumaru um, LSD phantom limb pain study that was published in 62, but started in 58. And, they showed like remarkable efficacy for, with only 50 mics. And I know how much effort you put in helping to track that down, and, working with CJ Spotswood to like literally find a copy of the study in English in the hard stacks at his medical school. And it's just, you couldn't find these anywhere online. Like originally that was, I think, a mimeograph of a mimeograph of the English abstract from the original Japanese publication,
It takes work.
Yeah. And then that was, I think Maps had that up,
Mm-hmm.
but like no one was talking about the Albert Lynn case study until PHRI got formed. And then Joel Castellanos et al., all of them really, put out Chronic Pain and Psychedelics, a review and proposed mechanism of action in May of 2020, right as I was leaving the study and had been just, pouring through the literature, trying to figure out what just happened and why is this so effective for
Mm-hmm.
chronic pain like this. This is far more than I had a reasonable right to expect. And that's the other thing. I had no expectation this would work. And that's kind of going back to my earlier point. It's like, it's easy to talk about my remission now, but I was struggling at the time, really, really struggling. And like both pain, chronic pain, and depression have a huge impact on emotional regulation, cognition, working memory, and there's a fair amount of willpower that gets sucked up in just trying to manage those. So, um, having this rapid acting effect, both for the depression, for suicidal ideation, but the chronic pain was just utterly astonishing. And, suddenly there's all this literature, and it's like, why isn't anyone quoting Kurumaru? This is nuts. This has been sitting there, and it's they had the neurology down way ahead
Yeah.
of time. Yeah.
I think you picked up on it being a little offensive that it wasn't being included. So that was really good on you for like tracking that down and pushing it, right? And you talked about it endlessly to a lot of people. And importantly, right? Like, where are we now in
Yes.
psychedelics and pain versus where we were
Yes.
3-4 years ago, which is nobody was talking about this when we started chatting, Court.
It's true. I mean, you could look at a couple of tight groups, for sure. There were people quietly working away at it. Like, you look at like Maastricht University, once again, James Close, Julia Bornman out at Imperial, obviously, um, Joel Castellanos, Tim Furnish et al., um, and as well as obviously Albert Lin and V.S. Ramachandran at UCSD. And then there's the vast long history of cluster busters, Bob Wold, Eileen Brewer out there, and
Well,
everything that they've
let's
been
name
doing.
what
But
they do. So they help people get an understanding and a handle on their cluster headaches, aka suicide headaches, and teach people how to get access and all that kind of fun stuff as a federally sanctioned nonprofit charity. So
that
amazing. And it's effectively an orphan condition too. It's too
that
small to receive like pharma funding.
yeah, and they've been plugging away at this for more than 2 decades. Starting in late '98 on a discussion board, right? And someone just popped up, some Scottish guy, saying, "Hey, has anyone ever taken LSD and found it caused a remission of their cluster cycle, or their or aborted an attack, or was prophylactic?" And people initially were very defensive and like, "Hey, don't come on here peddling your drug taking." But eventually a few other people started trying, when essentially this person insisted and found it to be absolutely true. And then they rapidly switched to psilocybin since it was far more readily available and controllable. And that led to the first psychedelic study at, sorry, I have to get this school right, at at Yale in like close to 50 years, right? And that's often been the case for so many of these researchers. But you're right when you say really this discussion wasn't going on until you and I started getting into it, because these people are operating in isolation, but there was almost no media that was falling on them, and bringing out like, hey, look, all these disparate teams are out there quietly beavering away in their labs, at the risk of their career reputations, and strictly out of service to people who are in some of the most desperate pain that is, really not imaginable. I've kind of emphasized this over the last year. Most of us in the general public do not have a personal reference for this level of chronic pain, and thank God for that, or the universe, and so it's 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 really the difference between a life worth living or not for some people, which sounds extreme, and hopefully I'm not conveying a sense of negation for people that are living with chronic pain, but we all know what that level of desperation and just raw discomfort can drive people to. And so, this has been um, one of the first really big rays of hope, and we're just seeing this broad um, efficacy across multiple conditions emerging. And when you look at the various mechanisms of action that are involved in creating chronic pain, in creating a chronic pain neurosignature or neurotag, what's happening, globally within their body, systemically, like say just with inflammation alone. Just as an example, recently there's a new case study on lupus. So 67-year-old man with advanced lupus, body-wide, musculoskeletal, very intense joint pain, biomarkers that are, elevated and high, clearly showing he's got lupus, finally decides to go to Oregon, right? And, seeking enlightenment. Literally, it says in the case study, seeking enlightenment, and takes 6 grams and immediately goes into a sustained remission from his lupus of over a year, with commensurate biomarkers showing a decrease, showing an actual measurable decrease in those biomarkers that are changes in the micro, RNA, DNA, sorry, microRNA. So it's it's sometimes, I obviously I get passionate about this. We all do, right? And sometimes it's a little exhausting trying to drive this message out there. But at the same time, it's like we've been very, very um, aggressive and, like you said, passionate about finding where these solutions have worked their way into different pain communities and the degree and the scale and the scope. And then with the work that Remap has started doing, quietly on our own with our own solo and group retreats, and like, having cases like, Lynn, where we just see this shockingly effective turnaround in like what had been considered completely intractable pain conditions that they'd had for no less than 2 decades, like body-wide CRPS compounded with, dual foot neuromas that were at level 10 pain as soon as she stepped on them in the morning. And then, after, additionally to that, with glossodynia, so burning mouth syndrome, and just seeing this complete reversal by following the evidence that is already published out there. You know, it's not like we're reinventing the wheel. We're just applying what is clearly and widely known. I mean, that's something I know we want to go into much more in depth on a separate episode, but it bears mentioning since we're coming up on her 6-month anniversary,
Mm-hmm.
of being in total remission from something that was like agony.
Yeah. When I met her and she described to me very calmly how much pain she was in, it was mind bending. So we got a new thing here from Dr. Samuel Douglas, also Rawmakers, Hutton, Mason, Dulder, Thunison, Holtze, Cupers, though they don't cite Kuramaru, which is good to
Interesting.
note. Yeah. So there's papers, right? There's people interested, and let's talk about what we did. So we partnered up with Clusterbusters after doing a lot of work with Remap and trying to figure out where we want to go. What are we doing together? And we said it's a lot better if we have a lot more people here contributing to this field. So we said let's develop a nonprofit and a network for people to share information around psychedelics and pain, and that's been the Psychedelics and Pain Association, psychedelicsandpain.org. Really amazing. So thank you for including me in that, and like it's been really amazing to see what we've been able to do.
I mean, I couldn't imagine not including you or Clusterbusters in it, right? Just like between your honestly, Joe, your tireless advocacy, completely tireless and enthusiastic advocacy here, as well as your own personal history with chronic pain, and really being just unbelievably encouraging and receptive to the science and the data, and then like so many of us in the psychedelic space, it's the personal stories over and over and over again, the testimonies where it starts to stack up from individual incidents to, case subjects to case series to finally, we have pilot studies. Then you start to see larger studies. So, and we've been so fortunate to meet so many researchers in this field that have been beyond enthusiastic supporters of us, encouraging this type of promotion because they just really want this message to get out to the larger public and to populations that this can affect, and where we can just very broadly and sometimes very specifically affect funding and legislation to their advantage, which is why it's been great to see these initiatives for veterans, finally getting funding and support and directives from like the VA directly into investigating psychedelics for things like TBI or severe combat induced, complex PTSD.
Hmm.
All of those have shown, you know, really strong signal and great response to these interventions. And when you know the neurology that's leading to those issues and see how much crossover there is into other conditions, and often chronic pain conditions, it's an obvious point of focus.
So you've assembled a free course on the Psychedelics and Pain Association, along with a robust research map, so people can access those for free. Is that right?
That's correct. So if you, as you mentioned before, if you go to psychedelicsandpain.org, um, we have a entire um, series of sections laying out the history of research into psychedelics and chronic pain, the mechanisms of action, and the number of conditions um, that have shown good, strong signal and response, and then access hosted on your website to our online free coursework, Introduction to Psychedelics for Chronic Pain, right? And that has interviews, and it's specifically geared from a high level overview. It's specifically geared to clinicians and practitioners, informing them of the neurology that's involved in chronic pain. Once again, the history of investigation going all the way back to 1930, while also simultaneously acknowledging all the conveyed wisdom and tradition of knowledge from indigenous practitioners and underground practitioners for decades and literally millennia, right? And where we are seeing really um, bright opportunity in the data that's coming out of currently ongoing investigation. So once again, like Imperial College, they're doing I think the only currently active psilocybin investigation into fibromyalgia, though I believe University of Michigan is going to be starting up very soon. Um, and so both Julia Bornman and James Close, who are the co-PIs, they speak on our coursework. Dr. Joel Castellanos is conducting, I believe, the only active psilocybin for phantom limb pain investigation in the world. Dr. Devin Christie, she is speaking to us, and she is did a retrospective analysis of MDMA creating relief for chronic pain, and so forth. You know, we have in Professor Jan Rawmakers shared with us a whole and bunch of new data and knowledge, as well as people like Natasha Mason, Dr. Natasha Mason, on inflammatory conditions. We had Charles Nichols, Dr. Charles Nichols, also speaking on inflammatory mechanisms. It's a fairly long list. Dr. Boris Heifetz, who's in the middle of a psilocybin and non-specific low back pain study out at Stanford. It's just great, you know. And so and CJ Spotswood is on there talking about the pharmacology and drug-drug interaction. So all of those things are available, as well as presentations, the PDFs from their presentations, and all the work that is cited, right? So, and you mentioned the database. So we do have a live database of, and it's a live database because it's continually being refreshed as we find out about new trials or discover ones that we've missed in our pass through initially in our literature review. A live database of all the psychedelic and pain and autoimmune and inflammatory condition studies that have been out there. So there is a lot of data and resources for people to take advantage of.
Love that. So we got a fun comment here from somebody on LinkedIn. I'm going to show it on screen here.
Thank you.
Sounds like this person might be a physical therapist, but they do work with chronic pain people with psychedelics. And to your point, you've taught me this, Court, like pain is largely an output.
That is correct.
It's not actually a thing. It's something's not right. Check it out.
I completely concur with what they're saying. And this has been like what I've been trying to harp on, which is that there are so many interventions out there where it's possible to directly alter somebody's neuroplastic window, where the nervous system becomes malleable. Chronic pain is, people think this is the large error, and as this person has pointed out, people think that chronic pain is a sensation that's received from the limbs and the body, and that is coming up into the brain. But in fact, that's completely incorrect. Chronic pain is an output of the central nervous system that's a perception in response to potential or actual alert signals from the body. So we're receiving all this nociceptive input all the time, and then it has to be interpreted by various brain structures. You know, the thalamus is one key one, but of all of them, it gets gated back and forth and relayed, and then finally there's this kind of summation of signal where it's finally decided, you could say, by the central nervous system, is this pain or not? And if we have chronic pain, there doesn't have to be actual damage present anymore, but it's almost like you have an alarm system in your house and the wind keeps rattling a window, and so the alarm is constantly going off. Or even worse, you just have a little short in the wiring and it's just firing off that alarm system even though there's no intrusion. And that's what happens to a lot of people with chronic pain. So when we look at the mechanisms of action for psychedelics, say resolving something like depression, right, where you have these entrenched outputs, it's the same thing with chronic pain. Almost the same structures and networks that get entrenched in depression or PTSD virtually overlay those same ones for a lot of different types of chronic pain outputs. So we see this, this cortical landscape getting reorganized, and then new, fresh, healthy input is able to finally gain equal weighting and then reduce that pain output.
So that's a lot. The PPA, the Psychedelics Pain Association, will be collecting membership. So we're working to building out a large network of people to continue developing this field, supporting science, supporting networking of the scientists, and hopefully we can do some in-person events and contribute to some lobbying efforts. So one thing that you and I were discussing earlier was this whole REMS issue that's coming. So the FDA requires certain drugs that look ripe for abuse to have some sort of protocol around them for safety, right? I looked at the other drugs being protected in this protocol, Court. It's mostly like codeine, morphine, things like that are like really, really intense opioids. And so the plan is to add MDMA to that. And because MAPS is getting relatively close to approval, the FDA open for public comment. One of our colleagues, Eileen Brewer from Clusterbusters, had some concerns about the way this stuff was being framed. For instance, psychedelic treatments of all kinds need to be paired with psychotherapy. And what we've shown in the pain world, and has been shown in the pain world literature, that it's not necessarily true. The Clusterbusters community is literally the drug short circuits their cluster headaches. They should not be, and nobody should be required to take therapy along with psychedelic substances. I think for some conditions it certainly makes sense, but there's plenty of conditions where it does not make sense. For instance, clusters, for instance, limb loss, things like that, or straight neurological.
There's a spectrum of response, and there's a spectrum of intervention, and certainly of therapeutic intervention, that we need to be mindful of throughout the entire pain community. So in some cases, as you just mentioned, the cluster headache community has a long history of effectively using relatively low dose psilocybin or something like LSD to abort or prophylactically prevent or to cause an early remission of their cycles, right? And they do that at home, typically with a trusted caregiver nearby, but there's very little emphasis in their case on the experience-mediated aspects. It is the actual pharmacokinetics that seem to be making the biggest impact in their pain. And once again, as you mentioned, they are an orphan condition, and it's the most severe pain known to medicine, right? And that's been fairly definitively established that it's a type of pain that is so intense. They actually kind of consider it more of a neurological condition than a pain condition within that world, right? And to see it respond so strikingly, it shows that there's much more going on here than this just psychological revisioning or reframing. But you look at other pain conditions where there is a very intense neurological aspect, but often there's also a very intense psychological aspect. And so that's where having an experienced practitioner, we envision something like, within REMAP, and this is something we've been working on, that there'll be both medical, clinicians as well as practitioners that are doing a lot of cross education in order to gain the skill sets on some degree of the other team. So like we have, practitioners that have been working in the underground for multiple decades, where you see something like apprenticeship going on is a way of learning, right? Versus you have medical clinicians that have gone through this, classic Western education certification model, right? And each each team needs to be conversant with the other team's nomenclature and approach in order to be an effective care team, right? They need to be able to, like, the clinicians need to have more of a, you could say, um, familiarity with what can happen during a non-ordinary state of consciousness, right? And the people that are practitioners need a much greater understanding or developed understanding of what happens in a complex presentation from a neurological standpoint, as well as potentially drug interactions and things like that. Because the people that are going to typically be ending up in what we're seeing so far, people that are ending up seeking out psychedelics to deal with chronic pain, often have exhausted standard of care approaches. They're usually polypharma, taking multiple drugs. So that's something we have to be aware of, and how to navigate, mitigate, adjust. And then often they have what's called a complex presentation. It's not just like peripheral neuropathy; it's peripheral neuropathy and diabetes post cancer treatment. Something like that, where there's so many things that we have to be mindful of. And I know there's many practitioners out there in good faith thinking, they just need to, you know, go through kind of their interior and work on surrendering to the experience, and maybe, like, titrating all the way down off their medication, and then let the medicine do its work. And they've probably had good confirmation bias, where they've seen people, go out and have that happen to them. But once again, there's people that go out there and don't have such a response, because how you treat each individual pain client varies widely. It's a spectrum. So for us to only emphasize a therapeutic intervention is completely disabling vast communities of pain patients, where they've proved that they can do this on their own safely and effectively. You look at the survey study from Maastricht of 250 chronic pain patients using macro and micro doses very effectively for chronic pain. You look at the case series out of PHRI of pain patients microdosing and macrodosing psilocybin for very, very severe chronic pain, and they're doing it on their own because, like, they're forced to. You know, what we want to do is to make sure all these communities have you know, a series of options for guidance and support. Whether that's like, I need to go, speak to a pharmacist about my psilocybin dosage, right, for my cluster headaches or my migraines or what have you, and just get, um, risk reduction and benefit maximization guidance. Or do I need to go to my local physiotherapist and my physiatrist for dealing with, like, say, multiple digit loss after, very severe, type 2 diabetes, or if I, like, survived like a car crash, or sorry, like, I got introduced to someone who is the victim of a drunk driving accident, and they lost their limb right there. And if someone had not been along to essentially throw their belt around that person's lower limb, they would have just bled out, total exsanguination right there on the street. And it's been a massive struggle for them since then, getting relief from their phantom limb pain and all the interventions. And it's just like, had never heard of the fact that this is an option for treating phantom limb pain. And, like, someone like that, like, that's a care team. That's a care team where they need real close and careful maintenance and guidance. But if you're talking like a lot of people out there with just, like, say, sciatica, or, once again, peripheral neuropathy, or, and in isolation, right? The more complex the presentation, the more I think, best practice is you're working with a care team, you're working with people that have like, deep clinical experience here. But, there's a lot of clinicians, and like we saw the doctor that came on here, there's a lot of clinicians that are so eager to open this up and give this a try, because people walk in and they say, hey, I'm not in pain anymore. What did you do? I took mushrooms, you know, or you have someone like, say, um, Jim, who is fortunately in, Outside Magazine, who like, spinal cord injury survivor, months and months and months in neurorehabilitation, goes to a festival, takes a little bit of a mushroom chocolate bar, and within a half an hour they're having sensory and motor restoration in muscle groups that had been non-responsive to the interventions up to that point. It's
He was
it's
at
kind of
Colorado's
mad.
top tier neurological rehab facility, Craig
Yes,
Hospital. Yeah.
and no disrepute to Craig
Mm-hmm.
Hospital or anybody out there. It's like, the thing is, these are impact boosters for neuroplasticity. And so we absolutely know that like there are all these adjunctive therapeutic approaches that can make this, impact in people's recovery and their rehabilitation. But sometimes everything works, but nothing lasts. Like, and by careful preparation, so priming the nervous system, getting people ready for a non-ordinary state of consciousness, finding regressions to interventions that show promise, but maybe aren't enduring or quite impactful enough. Then you introduce psychedelics. And then during that, critical period reopening, as described by Dr. Gould Dolen, right? You know, that's when you can really make striking progress, right? And that's when you have an adjunctive intervention, like so Albert Lin and V.S. Ramachandran in their the 2018 paper that really kind of got a lot of this going in the modern era, outside of Clusterbusters work, was Albert Lin, phantom limb pain, post a surgical amputation of a very, very damaged limb from a car accident, right? Immediately has intractable phantom limb pain, standard of care opioids, and things like that, which often do not work for central sensitization, right? Uh, Here's about, likely because of the cluster communities, right? Here's about psilocybin being effective, takes a high dose, he's out of pain for approximately 18 hours, right? But then it comes back, right? And because he's there at UCSD as a grad student, V.S. Ramachandran, the inventor of mirror box therapy, is there, and he's doing on site in the clinic. He's doing mirror box therapy, which is also effective, but as soon as he stops it, the pain comes back. Then his wife suggests, why don't you combine the two, right? And he's in a pain-free condition for close to, it was something like, I don't know, 19 hours or longer, and 50% reduction in his pain levels for more than 2 weeks. Does it again with more neuromodulation interventions, mostly visual, and finally goes at 5 weeks post dosing, doing this hybrid approach, goes into complete and total remission, enduring remission, right? So it's 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 a resource I don't think we're ever going to be able to exhaust in terms of um, our investigations and really the myriad of approaches we can use. There's so many different types of interventions that can be combined with this, and Dr. Castellanos thinks that this is going to become a whole new class of medications, and I completely agree.
So the hyperbolic thing I like to say, Court, and you can bump me later for this, but I think this field has the potential, maybe even remap as part of that, to reduce global chronic opioid prescriptions by 80%. And like, I think that's the aspirational goal, and I think that's possible. It's a lot of work. It's probably like 80 years ahead of us, but like there's something there.
It certainly can reduce the total burden. It can certainly reduce the total burden. And like when we consider, like, was it, I think it was 2018, 80,000 Americans, just Americans, died of opioid overdose from prescriptions, and then, like, off, when their prescriptions are canceled and then they switch to other opioids that are available in the street, just to maintain what is now like an addiction. It's like, it's one of those things where we know opioids are a valuable part of treatment options for chronic pain clients, but they have their risks. They have their risks, and we need to expand these options. I spoke to one case subject who had very, very severe sciatica. Like, asked their doctor, "Can I have my leg surgically removed if that will help?" Like, that's how desperate they were. 2 failed laminectomies, 7 failed spinal epidurals, and then finally they see the episode about Jim in Outside, start microdosing. Within 2.5 weeks, they wake up one morning and the pain is gone, and they're back to snowshoeing within a month after being out of, essentially, not even to walk down their driveway to check the mailbox for roughly 2 years. It's coming, and we need to prepare for this training bottleneck, because we need informed practitioners out there desperately, desperately. And, like, it who has the broadest base of knowledge and the most approach informed, uh, broadly informed approach. There's so many traditions and approaches for psychedelics, and to say that only one is the correct is, I think, not useful. So being able to do a broad survey,
If not
highlight.
super harmful.
Yes, thank you. That's right. Yes, we've all seen people that are at risk of drowning and things like that, and we can talk about other, like,
So
dangerous
you have to
practitioners.
run, Court, in a couple of
Oh,
minutes
it's
here.
that time.
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
getting close. I
Okay.
unfortunately watch the clock too much. So, people, please check out Psychedelics and Pain Association, Remap Therapeutics. Court is running some retreats coming up, coaching retreats. And we will, I think Remap will be having some training events in the near future as well. So stay tuned for that kind of stuff. But Court, thank you. Thanks for everything you've done. Thanks for letting me be involved in some way, and it's been awesome.
I mean, couldn't do it without you, Joe. I mean, the contribution you and Psychedelics Today have made in, like, being able to bring this forward. I mean, hyperbolic. I mean, I feel like it's a little epic defining in a way, because really this is something that is being reported in the regular medical press with, increasing frequency, and people are now starting to understand the underlying mechanisms that make this possible.
Right on. And for those of you that want to keep Psychedelics Today going, check out vitalpsychedelictraining.com for our Vital 12-month program. We believe it's the top tier training option in the space, and likely a liberal arts degree in the space. Everybody, it gets a little hyper focused, right? And we want everybody to really have a real broad view. So check out what we've got going. Classes start later this month, so you still have time to join. But Court, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the work, and I just can't wait to keep helping more people with you.
No, absolutely. It's, taking navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists was one of the best decisions I ever made. It's been such the carryover has been, the way everything has unfolded is, it's a life worth living. So thank you.
Absolutely, Court. All right. Well, until next time, thank you everybody for tuning in. This is Joe Moore, Psychedelics Today. See you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.